Hello, and welcome to our lecture over the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is perhaps one of the tougher topics of anatomy and physiology, but it's also one of the most fascinating because this is how our cells communicate with each other all over our bodies to maintain homeostasis. And they do so through little chemical messengers called hormones. So stick with me. We're going to go over the anatomy and histology of the endocrine system, but most importantly, go over all the various hormones that our body uses and how different systems communicate with each other to maintain homeostasis. Let's go. Let's get started talking about the difference in the nervous system and the endocrine system in terms of how they regulate things in our body. So you've likely already started learning about the nervous system, and that is where messages from the brain or the spinal cord are able to travel through neurons and meet up with a target cell, such as a skeletal muscle, and cause something to happen, like for the skeletal muscle to contract. So that's the nervous system. The endocrine system is the other regulatory system of the body. Most of the things that happen in our body are happening because of some kind of chemical signals in the form of hormones that are received from some kind of endocrine organ to the target cell. So in general, the endocrine system functions kind of like this little cartoon that you see up here. So some endocrine organ, it could be one of these that you see highlighted in this picture. Maybe it's the pancreas or the thyroid gland or gonad or the pineal gland. One of these endocrine organs is going to produce or secrete some kind of chemical hormone. Usually they're proteins. And in most cases, these proteins are going to travel through our bloodstream to particular target cells that they want that cell to do something. So for example, you see this chemical messenger here. See if we can start this thing over. It's a hormone. It's going to travel through the bloodstream, and what it's going to do is bind to a receptor on or in a target cell. So for example, maybe the target cell is inside of the thyroid gland, which is in the anterior part of your neck here, right over your larynx. And maybe that chemical messenger came from the anterior pituitary gland in the brain. It's sending out that chemical messenger, maybe it's thyroid stimulating hormone, to tell that thyroid to release other hormones. So in general, the messenger is binding to the target cells in the thyroid gland in this example and causing that thyroid gland to do something. So illustrated with the little stars that pop up here. So I mentioned some of these hormones will target the surface of the cells. So if you recall, the plasma membrane of a cell is a phospholipid bilayer with lots of proteins and things stuck in it. And so sometimes there will be proteins that we call receptors that are specific to a particular hormone chemical messenger. In other words, the amino acid chain, the way it's configured, its polarity, will allow it to bind like a hand to a glove to the shape of a particular chemical messenger hormone. And so it'll bind, and when it binds, it causes a conformational change in that receptor protein, and that elicits a response somewhere inside the cell. And again, sometimes these hormones bind to receptors in the plasma membrane. Other times they actually travel through the plasma membrane and bind to receptors inside the cell. So we'll talk about when each scenario happens in a little bit. But in general, our cells in our body communicate with each other through chemical messenger hormones, and that allows us to maintain homeostasis. So this homeostasis includes all the big things that we do in our body. So everything from fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance to growth, to the regulation of all the metabolic reactions in our body, stress responses, pretty much everything your body does, hormones are going to be involved in some way or another. So we're going to learn about how this happens and all the many different hormones, the principal ones that our organs produce. There are way too many hormones to present in this one lecture, but we're going to go over the main ones. So let's go. So it's clear that both the nervous system and the endocrine system are regulatory systems of the body. And in fact, these two systems work together very closely. So both involve cell-cell communication. So for example, the nervous system, you might recall, will have neurons that secrete neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine that directly contact the target cell and cause a response. And usually that response is short-lasting, like the reaction just happens right away. Now, in the endocrine system, oftentimes, and I'd say most oftentimes, the target cells are at some distance away from the cell that's actually producing the chemical messenger. So, for example, maybe the anterior pituitary is producing a hormone like ACTH, and it's going to target the adrenal glands all the way down, sitting on top of the kidney. So those chemical messengers have to travel far through the body, through the bloodstream. And because of that, initially those chemical messengers will be released into the extracellular fluid, the interstitial fluid, and then diffuse on into the capillaries and get into the bloodstream that way. So the general pathway for these is these chemical messengers, the hormones, are going to go into the venous capillaries, from there into the veins, back to the heart, out to the arteries, the arterial capillaries, and eventually reaching those receptors on or in the target cells. And so once this happens, once they reach their target cells, the effects can be anywhere from a few seconds to several days. So compared to the nervous system, the effects of the endocrine system are much more longer lasting. So if you look at this little chart here, it gives you a nice comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system in terms of the definition, the composition. So for example, the nervous system is a collection of neurons, whereas the endocrine system is a collection of glands. In terms of how these chemical messengers are transported, the nervous system uses electrical impulses, whereas the endocrine system uses hormones. Again, the nervous system is fast, the endocrine system is slow, but longer lasting. So it's always an interesting study to study the difference between these two systems in terms of their overall effect on regulating homeostasis in the body. Okay, up here in the corner now. All right, let's talk about 3 ways that these endocrine cells communicate with other cells. So these are 3 cell signaling pathways. So the classical one, the classical endocrine signal pathway, means that signals are released into the blood and travel long distances to their target cells. So what we were just talking about, right? If this was an endocrine gland cell, produces its hormone signal, and off it goes into the bloodstream until it comes to contact with a receptor in or on a target cell. However, occasionally you have cells that are near each other, both endocrine cells usually, and these guys will talk to each other over a very short distance. So you might have one endocrine cell, it secretes its chemical hormone to the next cell. And so it doesn't have to travel through the whole bloodstream, it can just travel through the extracellular fluid, the ECF. And finally, there's a scenario of autocrine endocrine signals. And this is where a signal is sent to itself, essentially. So you have a cell here, it's going to produce its chemical hormones, it releases that into the extracellular fluid, and then it comes back to the same cell and binding to a receptor on that same cell. So you can see these little diagrams that kind of just illustrate this phenomenon between endocrine, classical endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine glands. So several diagrams here for you to understand that concept. Now let's talk about the primary organs of the endocrine system. So in general, there's 7 primary organs, and then there's several secondary organs as well. So one of the things about endocrine glands is you can contrast them with what you might have learned before about exocrine glands. So you might remember that exocrine glands have ducts where they deposit their secretions into. Endocrine glands are ductless. They're made of glandular epithelial cells, and they take their products and they secrete it right into the interstitial fluid, the extracellular matrix. And from there, they either go to another nearby cell themselves or through the bloodstream, which is most common, to a target cell. So in most cases, they are transported by the blood, with the exceptions that we already went over. So here are the primary endocrine glands we're going to need to know. One, the anterior pituitary gland. And so you find this right in the brain here, right below another gland that we'll talk about, or another nervous tissue, set of nervous tissue we'll talk about, called the hypothalamus. So the anterior pituitary is actually part of the pituitary gland, which consists of 2 parts, the anterior and the posterior. So we're going to talk about both of these, but the anterior pituitary gland produces a whole lot of different hormones, and it is kind of the lieutenant of endocrine glands. We're going to talk about the thyroid gland, like you see here, which is, as we said, found in the anterior part of the neck here, right over the larynx. And if you were to take that thyroid gland out and flip it around, you're going to see little dots here. These are called parathyroid glands. They're just little dots on the back of the thyroid gland, and they also produce hormones. Then we're going to talk about the adrenal cortices, which are part of the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of the kidneys. So there's actually things we're going to talk about that are produced both from kind of the edge of the adrenal gland, the cortices, or each adrenal cortex, and the inside of the adrenal gland, which is the adrenal medulla. But the cortex is actually considered a primary endocrine organ. In addition, we have the endocrine pancreas. So your pancreas is right there, kind of behind your stomach, and it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. And you can see the pancreas right here. You can see it kind of looks like a big old worm. But anyway, it has endocrine functions that are going to secrete hormone chemical messengers that are going to help regulate blood sugar levels. And it also has exocrine functions in which the cells are secreting digestive enzymes. So we'll talk about that difference in a little bit. And finally, the seventh primary organ of the endocrine system is the thymus gland. And you see this, and it sits in the mediastinum, kind of right on top of the heart. And it's very large in infants and children, and we adults, it's going to shrink way down. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so we mentioned that in addition to the primary organs of the endocrine system, there are also secondary organs. And they're called secondary because these organs are part of other organ systems. So they have multiple functions, but they do function in the endocrine system. So three of the obvious ones are what we call neuroendocrine organs. So in other words, they consist of nervous tissue, but they also secrete some kind of neurohormone. So one of the obvious examples of this is the hypothalamus, which is found in the base of the diencephalon and kind of right above the pituitary gland. And in fact, it bosses the pituitary gland, both the anterior and the posterior pituitaries. So that boss gland is consisting of nervous tissue. The pineal gland is found more towards the back of the diencephalon. And it's this little gland, some people like to call it the third eye because it registers light and dark, and in response will produce the hormone melatonin, which you've probably heard of, and that's part of our sleep-wake cycle, and we'll talk more about that later in the lecture. And that adrenal medulla that I mentioned. So here's a cross-section through an adrenal gland sitting on top of a kidney. So the adrenal cortex is a primary endocrine organ, but the adrenal medulla on the inside is almost like a separate organ. It consists of nervous tissue and also produces neurohormones. So other secondary endocrine organs that we're going to talk about, the heart. Like, who would have guessed the heart is part of the endocrine system? It is a secondary endocrine organ. It produces hormone. Kidneys themselves, the small intestine, adipose tissue, so fat, and even cancer cells can all be considered secondary parts of the endocrine system because they can produce hormone. Now, we've been talking about how hormones actually travel and bind to receptors in or on receiving target cells. So let's talk a little bit more about that idea that some hormones like to bind to protein receptors that are embedded in the plasma membrane of the cells, while others will actually go straight through that plasma membrane and bind to protein receptors inside the cell to elicit a response. So one class of hormones of the two are what we call amino acid based. In other words, they're made of amino acids. And you'll recall from way back when that there are 20 amino acids that make up all the hundreds of thousands of different proteins that exist in life. And those proteins do all sorts of things, right? They're the most diverse kind of molecule out there for the body. So they do everything from acting as enzymes to speed up reactions or digest things, to creating structure like hair, to, serving immune functions. They do all sorts of things, and many hormones are themselves either proteins or amino acids that would, if put together, comprise proteins. So Amino acid-based hormones can come in one of three types. So we have amine hormones, where the whole hormone is just one little amino acid, one of those 20 amino acids. Some are peptide hormones, where there's, several of these amino acids put together. And then you have hormones that are complete proteins. So these are called protein hormones. So we have amine, one amino acids, peptides, several amino acids, and proteins, which are just enough amino acids that the entire protein is intact. And so these kinds of hormones are going to be produced by the pituitary gland, the pancreas, the thymus gland, the thyroid gland, and the parathyroid glands. And in almost all cases, with the exception of a couple, they are hydrophilic. And you'll recall that hydrophilic means they love water. And that allows them to travel through the blood without having to be bound to any other molecule to help them transport. So because blood is mostly water, so it's hydrophilic, and these amino acid-based hormones, in most cases, are hydrophilic. So they're able to travel very easily through the bloodstream, which is really important for them to be able to get to their target cells. Now, there are two exceptions off the top of my head that to this idea that amino acid-based hormones are hydrophilic, and that is thyroid hormone and growth hormone. So thyroid hormone is hydrophobic. So in other words, it fears water. Growth hormone, both of these are going to have to be bound to other molecules. So like in the case of growth hormone, it's going to have to find particular other proteins in the blood to bind to so that it actually can travel through the blood. However, the other class of hormones are what we call steroid hormones, or sometimes it's called lipid-soluble hormones. These are hydrophobic hormones. So they're all hydrophobic. Therefore, in order to travel through the blood, they have to be bound to other proteins in the blood. And so these ones are all derived from the compound cholesterol, which you've probably heard of. It's a four-ringed structure. So if you look over here at these classes of hormones, you can kind of see the structural differences here, and I have examples of a protein hormone there. So each of these is a little amino acid, so these would be peptide hormones and other kinds of amino acid hormones here. So you see they bind directly to receptor proteins in the plasma membrane, and they're hydrophilic. Whereas these hydrophobic ones that derive from cholesterol, so there's cholesterol, here is an example, cortisol, which is a derivative of cholesterol. Because they're lipid soluble, they actually go straight through the plasma membrane and bind to receptors inside of the cell. So why do we want hormones that can actually have to have other proteins to bind to in the blood to be able to travel? Well, because they're not going to travel as fast as the amino acid-based ones, we end up getting a reservoir of these hormones in the blood, which is a good thing because we basically have a storage of these so that when we need them, boom, we can get them. And it extends the half-life of the hormones. So in other words, like every chemical, it can only last so long. These amino acid-based hormones tend to have very short half-lives, so they have to travel fast to their target cells because they're going to degrade pretty quickly, whereas the steroid hormones have a longer half-life. And so by being able to be bound to something else and be able to be stored in the blood, they're going to be able to last longer. It's almost like you were kind of putting them in the refrigerator, that's going to keep them alive longer, but instead we're putting them in our blood. So this keeps large fluctuations of hormone concentration from happening in the blood because you always have a steady supply. And so it helps your body not to go out of whack with homeostasis. It keeps it nice and balanced. Organs that produce these steroid hormones are the adrenal cortices and the gonads. So we'll be spending some time talking about those. Now, by now you may be wondering, what exactly do hormones do? So we know they get sent out, and the amino acid-based ones bind to receptors in the plasma membrane in all but two cases, like growth hormone and thyroid hormone. And some of them go straight through the membrane if they're steroid-based, and they bind to receptors inside the cell. Okay, so they do all that, but what exactly are they doing? So the answer is they do all sorts of things. They tell your cells what needs to be done, basically. So here are some of the hormone actions. So hormones can stimulate other cells to secrete their substances. So, for example, a lot of the hormones from the anterior pituitary were released because they got signals from the hypothalamus. And once they get those signals, those hormones from the anterior pituitary tell other organs to secrete their hormones. And sometimes even their hormones tell other cells what to secrete. So it's really kind of like a messenger system. It's kind of like playing a relay race or the telephone game, like one tells the other what to do. And so this keeps the correct hormones being secreted at the correct concentrations to maintain homeostasis. Some hormones will tell target cells to either activate or inhibit certain enzymes from functioning. And remember, enzymes do all sorts of things from catalyzing reactions to digesting substances. And so it's important that they're under tight control, and that regulation comes from hormones. Hormones can activate or inhibit mitosis and meiosis, so cell division, growth. So for example, check out the cell that's in mitosis here. Remember prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And so that process of mitosis is ultimately regulated by hormones. Hormones can tell proteins to change shape, and therefore that can close off or open up ion channels. And speaking of ion channels, remember that ion channels, by opening and closing, regulate membrane potential on either side of a membrane. So remember, sodium potassium channels, for example, will determine whether the overall cell has a negative, positive, or neutral membrane potential. So all of that is regulated by hormones. And finally, one of the other actions is that hormones can tell cells when and what to transcribe. So these steroid-based hormones will actually, after binding to receptors inside the cell, they travel into the nucleus and bind to particular areas of the DNA, so particular genes, and they can transcribe those genes by turning on or turning off the genes. And remember from protein synthesis that when a gene is turned on, you get messenger RNA, which travels to the cytoplasm, meets up with a ribosome, and produces a certain protein. And so that production of that protein, whether it happens or not, is often tightly regulated by hormones binding to that DNA with their receptors. It's amazing and fascinating. And the fact that everything we do is based on proteins that are ultimately controlled by hormones. How cool is that? Now, you've been learning about how hormones actually target cells through binding of receptors, either in the plasma membrane or inside the cell. Now, the way that they bind is kind of interesting. It's dependent on what hormone we're talking about, what gland we're talking about, and what receptor we're talking about. So one way that hormones can bind to receptors is by targeting only one cell type. So for example, the hypothalamus is releasing hormones that it produces. It produces several of those. We'll mention some of those later. Well, they only target cells of the anterior pituitary. So only cells of the anterior pituitary will be receptive to that because they have the correct receptors. Even if that hormone reaches other cells, they won't be receptive to it. So targeting of one cell type is one binding mechanism. In other cases, there are hormones that can actually target multiple cell types. So an example of this is thyroid hormone, which is actually able to target pretty much all the cells of the body. They'll all be receptive to that hormone. And then there's hormones that can reach more than one type of cell, but they're only responsive, or they only bind to one type of cell receptor. So even though they're reaching many cells with many different receptors, they'll only be receptive to one type of receptor. And then there's cases where the same hormone can bind to many different receptor types, but the effect of that hormone on that cell will depend on which receptor received the hormone. So different receptors will end up producing different effects on the cell. So those are just some mechanisms by which hormones can actually bind to receptors and target cells. Now, you at this point understand the concept that chemical signals are secreted by cells of endocrine organs and reach target cells and bind to the receptors to elicit an effect. But what starts it all off? Well, there's really three ways that this can happen. One, hormonal stimuli. In other words, the cell of an endocrine gland receives a signal of another hormone from some other hormone producing gland. And that tells that cell to release its hormone. So that's hormonal stimuli. Humoral stimuli, if you think of the humors of like the medieval ages, this is where the hormone producing cell is aware of what the concentration of a particular ion or even other hormones are in the blood, and they will produce the correct amount of hormone based on what that gland is signaling is the concentration around it. So either in the blood or the extracellular fluid. So example of this, the hypothalamus is constantly registering what's the concentration, and producing its hormones to tell other glands what to produce based on what that surrounding concentration of ions or hormone is. And then finally, some cells are triggered to produce their hormones or secrete them based on neural stimuli. So an example of this, the posterior pituitary gland, while it does not produce its own hormones, it stores and releases hormones that were produced in the hypothalamus. And it knows when to secrete those based on receiving an electrical signal through neurons from the hypothalamus. So through these three processes, we're going to help the body to maintain homeostasis. And the way this generally happens, you've heard it before, negative feedback loops, right? So the body's constantly registering like a thermostat. If there's a set point, that's where the body wants to be. That's homeostasis. If concentrations of something go above that set point, then mechanisms will kick in this case in the form of hormones, to bring everything back to that set point and vice versa. So that's that negative feedback loop. So most of our hormones in the body function with negative feedback loops. Examples would be like insulin and glucagon secreted from the pancreas that will help to maintain blood glucose levels. There are a couple of positive feedback loops with the endocrine system. This would be, for example, dealing with milk production and uterine contractions. But those are temporary. They eventually, over time, will go back to a negative feedback loop when the stimulus changes. So hormonal, humoral, and neural stimuli are the ways we're going to set off our hormone cascade. Okay, so by now you seem to be very familiar with this idea that endocrine cells produce hormone. The hormones act as chemical messengers. They travel in most cases through the blood and bind to target receptors either in the cell membrane or in the cytosol of the cell. So a little more detail about that. We said that the hydrophilic hormones, the water-loving ones, with the exception of growth hormone and thyroid hormone, like to bind to receptors in the plasma membrane, and that is true. Those hydrophobic hormones, though, the water-fearing ones, the steroid hormones, the lipid-soluble hormones, those guys, for the most part, with the exceptions we just talked about, they will actually travel straight through that phospholipid bilayer in the plasma membrane and bind to receptors inside the cell. Now, once bound to those receptors inside the cell, those hydrophobic hormones will actually travel into the nucleus through the nuclear membrane and bind with their receptors to certain parts of the DNA where they can choose to turn on a gene or turn off a gene. So they become transcription factors at that point. Now, we talked about how most hormones follow negative feedback loops, which most things in the body do. And a couple, like for example, the production of milk, follow a positive feedback loop. And one of the cool things that can happen is something called upregulation. So our body is constantly registering what is the concentration of hormone in the blood. And if the hormones follow a negative feedback loop, then when that blood hormone concentration is low, there's not a lot of a lot of hormone in the blood, then signals will be given that will increase the number of receptors for that hormone in the cell. And so that is called upregulation, where more protein receptors for a hormone are produced because there's not much hormone in the blood. In other words, the more receptors you have, the more binding sites you have for those hormones to bind to. So that happens a lot in negative feedback loops. Positive feedback loops, same idea, except in this case, when there's a lot of hormone in the blood, more receptors are produced. So even more binding sites because we want to keep amplifying that effect. So in both cases, that's what's known as upregulation. Downregulation is kind of the opposite, that when you have a high blood hormone concentration, there's a lot of hormone in the blood, then signals will be given that will decrease the number of receptors that are produced. So there'll be less binding sites for those hormones. And so you basically want the opposite effect. If there's too much hormone, then decrease those binding sites by decreasing the amount of receptor produced, and that will bring that hormone concentration in the blood down. So upregulation and downregulation. If you look at these pictures, if a case of upregulation, you start off in this hypothetical scenario with 2 receptors for a particular hormone, and over time, upregulation is occurring and more receptors are produced. Downregulation is the opposite. You're starting with a lot of receptors, and because the blood hormone concentration is high, over time, less and less receptors are produced. So that's upregulation and downregulation. Now we're going to talk about second messenger systems. So there are various ways, as you're learning, that hormones can trigger cells to do something. And many of the processes in our body with regards to hydrophilic hormones happen through second messenger systems. So we're going to be going over an example of this in just a second. But in general, here's what happens. So as you have already learned, hydrophilic hormones, most of them anyway, like to bind to receptors that are embedded in the plasma membrane. So you see one here. Here's a nice hydrophilic hormone binding to a protein receptor in the plasma membrane. So here would be outside the cell, and here's inside the cell. Well, in some cases, when this happens, it causes a conformational change in the protein, and that change will then trigger other events to happen. In fact, it will trigger the production of what we call second messenger products. So the most famous second messenger system is what's called G protein linked receptors. And how this works is you're going to have a protein embedded in the membrane, a nice receptor, and when the ligand or the hormone signal binds to that receptor protein, you get a conformational change. All those amino acids shift around, and that causes another protein called an inactive G protein to make its way through the plasma membrane, bind to that altered and now activated receptor protein, and that's going to cause the replacement of what's called GDP to a molecule called GTP. And once that happens, this now activated GTP protein is going to migrate back on through that plasma membrane, and we're on the inside of the cell now, and it's going to hit an enzyme, and when it binds there, it activates that enzyme, leaves behind a phosphorus or phosphate, and now it's ready to do it again. Well, by now activating that enzyme can activate other things, which causes a whole cascade effect, and you can have one hormone that bound to that original receptor protein now causing hundreds of second messenger products to be produced. So hormone binding to the receptor causes the conformational change. In the case of G protein, that causes this G protein to dissociate into its parts, and we end up getting GDP leaving and GTP coming in, and that will then migrate and activate this enzyme, which will cause a cascade of production of second messenger compounds that we need. So let's take a close look at this little animation here. Okay, so you see that the ligand is binding to the receptor protein, causing a conformational change. Inactive G protein swaps GTP for GDP. Then that now active G protein migrates over to this inactive enzyme, swaps a phosphate, that activates the enzyme, and now it activates other enzymes and a whole cascade, which will produce a lot of second messenger protein. So now let's take an example. So now that you know how second messenger systems work, we're going to give an example with the famous adenylate cyclase C-AMP system. And just a note here, some books, instead of saying adenylate, they'll say adenylyl. Same thing, C-AMP. I like to call it CAMP, but it's not correct. It's C-AMP. Anyway, in this case, this is where a G protein's been activated by a protein receptor that has been conformationally changed by the binding of a hormone. So the hormone binds, changes the conformation, causes a swapping of GTP from GDP, and now that GTP is migrating over to an enzyme. So typical second messenger system that we've been talking about. But in this particular example, that enzyme that gets activated is adenylate cyclase. And watch what happens in this animation when that phosphate is transferred to the enzyme, activates it. Now an ATP is going to meet up with that enzyme and get split. So two phosphates leave and you're left with one phosphate from what was ATP. So this is now adenosine monophosphate. In other words, one phosphate, or better known as C-AMP. So C-AMP stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate because we're going to take two phosphates off the ATP. So we now have AMP, or adenosine monophosphate, or C-AMP. And the reason why the C is there for cyclic is because watch what happens. Once C-AMP is produced, that's your second messenger. It's now going to bind to an enzyme called protein kinase A. And when it binds to protein kinase A, you get this nice cascade of effects, so cellular responses. So if you look at this diagram up here, that first messenger, which is the hormone signal, the hydrophilic hormone, is going to bind to that G protein linked receptor, as it's called, in the plasma membrane, causing a conformational change. We swap GTP for GDP, and that activates this G protein, migrates along the plasma membrane, meets up with the enzyme, in this case, adenylate or adenylyl cyclase. Remember, anything ending with ASE is an enzyme. Activates that adenylyl cyclase. ATP is going to meet up with that enzyme and split. Two phosphates are going to leave from the three that were there, leaving one phosphate, which we call C-AMP, cyclic adenosine monophosphate. This is now your second messenger because it's kind of gotten the baton and it's ready to deliver that message to an enzyme. And in this case, it's protein kinase A. And it's protein kinase A that will now produce the cellular response. So again, this system is used a lot in our bodies, is a mechanism of cell communication. So let's just do a quick recap of hydrophobic hormones. So what we were just talking about with the second messenger system, in most cases, is hydrophilic hormones. But recall that the hydrophobic ones, because they're lipid soluble, are just going to diffuse right across the plasma membrane. They most of the time don't stop to bind to a plasma receptor, although they can. So these lipid soluble hormones are often known as steroids. And an example of this would be cortisol, for example. But thyroid hormone is not a steroid, but it does have hydrophobic properties. So again, with these guys, they diffuse across the plasma membrane, and they're going to meet up with protein receptors either inside the cytosol or inside the nucleus itself. And once the hormone has bound to the receptor, that then is called a hormone response element. And this HRE, or hormone response element, when it's in the nucleus, is actually capable of binding to the DNA and affecting the rate of protein synthesis for the production of whatever protein we're talking about. And so that is really interesting because it's going to mean that that hormone response element is essentially a transcription factor. And once upon a time, they didn't know there was a lot of transcription factors involved with the expression of genes. When I was in school, I would learn about DNA polymerase and a few like that. Well, the latest research has now shown that to express a single gene, sometimes there could be 1,000 different transcription factors all involved, all fumbling over each other like football players. So really interesting, again, active area of research to study these hormone response elements and how they serve as transcription factors and in general their role in gene expression for the production of proteins. By now you're familiar with the overall mechanisms of hormones, how they work. So whether they're hydrophilic, hydrophobic, what do they do in the body? How do they send messages? So we're going to close out this first part of our discussion of the endocrine system talking about tiers of hormonal control. And this is just a way of describing a hormone's role in a negative feedback loop. So recall from our early discussions of homeostasis that in general, there's always a receptor, a control center, and a response or an effector, something that does something. Well, that's certainly true of hormones. And so a lot of times, as you've seen, hormones will have someone sends a message that causes something to happen in another gland, maybe sends more messages, which causes something to happen in another gland, maybe sends more messages, or in a target tissue. So let's give the example of causing thyroid hormone to be produced from the thyroid gland. We initially are going to get a signal from the hypothalamus, the boss gland in the brain. It's going to send a signal to the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland, to release a hormone. And that hormone is going to be targeting cells of the thyroid gland to release their hormones. And we'll be getting into in part 2 exactly what hormones those are. But in this example, the hypothalamus would be tier 1, the pituitary or the middle management would be tier 2, and the cells that are targeted in the thyroid gland, that would be tier 3. So just another way of describing each hormone's role in that negative feedback loop. Okay, that's it for part 1 of the endocrine system. Join me in part 2, where we're going to get into the nitty-gritties of all the main hormones that are produced, where they're produced, and what they do for the body to maintain homeostasis. See you there.